All right, so in the previous lesson, we created this functional component right here, which renders some to-dos. So now I'd like to store these to-dos in states. So I'm going to store these to-dos in the state, and then I will map over to-dos array, and I'll put them in here. So as you may have guessed, in here, my main purpose is to show you how to use states in functional components, and that's why I'm going to do this, right? Okay. So normally, in order to use states inside of a component, we just have to use the class component, but with React hooks, like I've told you before, we can now use states inside of a functional component as well. And we can do that by using a hook called UseStates. UseState Hook is a function, and it's going to allow us to use a piece of state inside this functional component. So why don't we start off by importing that hook up at the top. Okay, so I'll put a comma, and I'll open up a set of curly braces, and we will import UseState Hook from React library like so. Okay, and then we can use this hook in here. So we'll say UseState, and we're just invoking a function. Then this hook accepts an argument, which is going to be the initial value for this piece of state that we want to use, just like we're doing in a class component. So we'll say something like, state is equal to an object where we define the different properties. So we're essentially doing the same thing in here as well. We're defining a property of the state inside this function. So for now, I want to define some to-dos inside an array, and that's going to be the initial value of this state. So I'm going to do an array of to-dos in here. So inside the array, I'm going to create objects, and each object would then be each to-do, right? So I'm going to say text as a key. And for the first to-do, I'm going to copy this one and paste it in here. As you may guess, each list item should have a unique key prop, and I'll say ID, and ID will be 1. Okay, so for the second to-do, I'll say text, and text will be do your homework. So I will copy and paste it as well, and this time the ID will be 2, just like that. And what was the last one again? Oh, can't forget to feed the dog. And ID will be 3. Okay, so each of these are objects, and each of these objects represents a single to-do, and each one has a unique ID as well. So now we have these 3 objects stored in this array as the initial value. So this function returns an array, and that array returns us 2 values. The first value is going to be the actual data, the state itself, and the second value is going to be a function which we can then use to edit that state. You with me? So it returns those 2 values inside an array. So we're going to use array destructuring to get these 2 different values. So I'm going to say const, and then array is equal to this thing, this UseState hook. And then for the 2 properties, we can call what we want. But generally, we will name them whatever the state is, whatever the state defines. So for example, I'm going to call the first property to-dos, and this is the state itself. And the second one is going to be set, and then whatever I call the state. So set to-dos. This is the function which we can use to edit this state. And we generally will name the function like this. It's kind of a community convention, but, it's pretty clear to me, and I would definitely recommend you to do the same. All right, so in this example, we have the state itself and also a function to change the state. And now we can use this state data inside this component instead of the list items. So I'm going to delete these list items. Now we can use to-dos to reference this array of data. And we can cycle through that array inside the template down here. So we don't want to hard code it, right? So I'm going to open up a set of curly braces and I'm going to say to-dos.map. And that's because we are going to map it to a new array of HTML templates. And then inside this function, we can take each to-do. This map function is going to cycle through the array, and in that array, we'll reference each item to this to-do each time. So now we can return some JSX for each item. And I'm going to say return, and then in parentheses, create an li tag. And inside the li tag, I want to output the text property of the to-do. So I'm going to say to-do.text. And then when we cycle through things like this, React expects us to provide a unique key property for each element as well. See, that's why I added this ID property right here. So let's add a key property, and then I'm going to say to-do.id. So now we're cycling through that state and outputting each list element. So why don't we just check it and see if it works? So I'll save it and jet over to the browser. All right, see, so we can see all of these things in the browser. So that's working. Now we can use state inside of a functional component just using this hook, UseState. And I don't know, I'm kind of beside myself. I think it's pretty awesome. I'm sure you will too in time. But what if we want to change the data? For example, if we want to add another to-do to state, how the heck do you do that? Well, let me show you a little trick I'm going to demonstrate. So I'll create a button down here. And when I click on it, it's going to add a new to-do in here, all right? So first of all, let's create that button. So under the UL tag, I'm going to say button. And inside the button, I'll say add a to-do. And we'll need to attach an on-click event handler to do this. And that is going to reference a function called add to-do. So let's create this function over here. We'll say const add to-dos and set that equal to an arrow function. And inside this function, what we want to do is change the state. Now remember, we said that this function will be able to get back from the use state is used to change the state data. So we're going to do that right here. All I do is say set to-dos, which is what we called the function. And then inside of here, we pass whatever value we want. So we want this data to be an array because we are mapping it in here. So we pass in an array, and this is going to completely replace whatever the current value of to-dos is. All right? So inside here, we can't just add something extra into this because it's going to completely replace it with this thing. So for that reason, we need to use the spread syntax like this. And that way we're going to get the current to-dos and spread them into this array. So we're going to grab each one of these and put them into this new array. And then we're going to want to add an additional to-do in this new array. And that's going to be a new object, which will have a text property. And this is just going to be new to-do. So I'm going to say text. And for the new to-do, let's say learn hooks. And then we need a ID property because we are mapping over the to-dos array in here. And as I mentioned before, when mapping over some elements, React demands us that we give a unique ID to each list element. So that's why we have these ID properties. We have 1, 2, 3. So when we click on this button, we're going to call this function, and in this function, we will get all the to-dos with the spread syntax, and then add a new to-do into this array. So when we click on this button, on each click, we have to add a new to-do with a new unique ID. So on each time to give a new unique ID to the new to-do, I'm going to say math.random to create an ID. So we will give the random numbers to new list items on each click. And yeah, you might be thinking it's not necessarily the best practice because, well, random numbers can match and we could get a warning again, but right now we've got a very tiny to-do list example here, and it's a little difficult, the probability to get the same numbers. But if you want to, you could use UUID npm as the package to create a unique ID, or you may find another ID generator package to create an ID in a more secure way. But you know what? I don't want to get too distracted and waste too much time doing all that to install new packages in the lesson, so that's why I'm going to do this right now. But you get the idea. All right? So let's save all this and get back to the browser. And I'm going to click on Add To-Do button. And we're going to add a new to-do over here. So I add a new to-do again, and a new one, and a new one. Okay, so it works. So what do you think? We've now used this UseState hook to use some state inside of our functional component. And we're just calling this the UseState hook here and giving it an initial value. And then right after that, this hook function returns us an array. And in that array, we're getting two items. The first one is the actual value of the state, and the second one is a function to change that value. That's pretty cool, and that's all about the UseState hook. And I think it's pretty awesome because we couldn't ever do this in the past. We'd always have to use a class component to use state. But now all we need to do is use one simple hook function to do all of that in functional components. This UseState hook, all right? So tuck that under your hat, and we'll take a short break here, and we'll see what to do in the next lesson.